Ever wondered who truly controlled the lives of Hollywood's biggest stars during the Golden Age? Was it the actors themselves, or did the studio bosses pull all the strings behind the scenes? In Hollywood's Golden Age, actors were more than just stars. They were assets. Studio bosses wielded immense power, dictating not just what films they would star in, but even their personal lives. From controlling relationships to choosing roles, these moguls shaped the careers and fates of some of the most iconic figures in film history. In this video, we'll take a closer look at how these studio heads controlled every move of the stars and how their influence went far beyond the screen. The studio system, a powerhouse of control. The Hollywood studio system, which dominated the golden age of cinema, wasn't born overnight. It started in the early 1910s and 1920s when the film industry was still in its infancy. At that time, the industry was largely unregulated, with actors, directors, and writers being hired on a freelance basis by whichever studio needed their services. But as Hollywood began to grow into the entertainment powerhouse we know today, so did the power of the major studios. By the 1930s, a select few studios had gained an iron grip over the industry, including giants like MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox. These studios weren't just movie makers. They were full-fledged corporate entities with deep financial resources, vast political influence, and enormous control over the stars who worked for them. The core of the studio system was a structure built on long-term contracts. Unlike today, where actors often have more control over their careers, stars in Hollywood's golden age were bound to one studio for years. Actors like Clark Gable, who became one of the era's most beloved leading men, didn't have the luxury of picking roles or working with any studio that they chose. Unless given special permission by the studio, they were required to stick to the films assigned to them. The studio had absolute control over when and where they worked, the types of roles they played, and even their personal lives. For many stars, their identity was no longer their own. They became the property of the studio. In some cases, studios would dictate personal details, like where the actors lived, how they dressed, and even who they dated. The lines between their professional and personal lives blurred, as the studio aimed to craft and maintain a particular image of their stars for the public. Stars were expected to embody the personas that their studios wanted them to project, often living up to highly curated public images of glamour and perfection. This system heavily benefited the studios. By locking talented actors into long-term contracts, they were able to produce films at a rapid pace, keeping their studios in the spotlight. The studio could count on a reliable roster of stars, each with their fan base, to appear in multiple films per year, ensuring a constant stream of box office hits. If a particular actor was successful in a film, the studio could quickly pair them up with other projects, maximizing their earnings and brand consistency. But for the stars, the reality of this arrangement was far more restrictive. While they gained immense fame and wealth, they were essentially owned by the studios. They had little freedom to explore other projects, change their public image, or even take time off. The spotlight could be all-consuming, and those who tried to rebel or break free faced severe consequences. Some stars even found themselves blacklisted or relegated to minor roles if they attempted to challenge the studio system's strict rules. For an actor to become a household name during this time, they had to make a significant sacrifice: control over their career and life. Fame came with a heavy price. While the public adored these stars behind the scenes, they were bound by the unyielding grip of the studio. So, how did these stars cope with this lack of control? And how did some of them eventually fight back against this overwhelming system? Studio bosses, the dictators behind the curtain. Behind the scenes of Hollywood's golden age, the true power lay not with the actors, but with the studio bosses. These men and women were the puppeteers, pulling the strings of the stars' careers and personal lives with an iron grip. They were often larger-than-life figures, not just in terms of their personalities, but in their influence over the entertainment industry. Many had backgrounds in business, and their focus was clear: making money and maintaining control. The studios were their empires, and their power was unmatched. One of the most notorious figures among these bosses was Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM. Mayer's reputation for being an authoritarian was legendary. His word was final, and his decisions were rarely questioned. What set him apart was his uncanny ability to control his actors in ways that went far beyond their professional lives. Mayer had a deep understanding of the psychology of his stars and used this knowledge to manipulate them. He was known to play with their emotions, telling them what they wanted to hear to keep them compliant. And it didn't stop with their careers. Mayer was infamous for meddling in their personal lives as well, using his influence to ensure that their private decisions aligned with the studio's needs. He had a talent for controlling not just their work, but their entire existence. Mayer wasn't the only studio boss with this kind of power. Darryl F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, was another towering figure in the studio system. Zanuck's management style was harsh and demanding, and he wasn't afraid to cross personal boundaries. Like Mayer, Zanuck controlled everything about his stars, from their public image to their relationships. It wasn't uncommon for him to dictate who his stars could date, what they could wear, or even how they should behave outside of the film set. If you were a star, you were expected to follow the rules. No exceptions. Disobeying the studio's demands could mean a quick fall from grace, with many stars sent into oblivion without hesitation. The reach of these studio bosses extended into every aspect of an actor's career. They controlled which roles actors would take, what kind of image they projected to the public, and even how they were marketed. The studio was in charge of shaping the public perception of their stars, and if that image faltered, it was the studio's job to fix it, whether the star liked it or not. If an actor's career seemed to be losing momentum, the studio would often step in to revive it. This could involve shifting their public persona, finding them a new role, or even completely changing their on-screen image. All of this was done with the studio's interests at heart, sometimes disregarding what the actor personally wanted or needed. It's hard to imagine today, but stars had little say in their careers. The studio bosses made the decisions, and their power was absolute. The actors were left with very few options: follow the boss's orders or risk being erased from the spotlight. But what happened to those who tried to break free from this system? How did some stars attempt to wrestle back control of their own lives and careers? Personal lives, an extension of professional control. One of the most troubling aspects of Hollywood's golden age was the way the studio system reached far beyond the professional lives of its stars, extending deep into their worlds. For studio bosses, an actor's public image was a carefully crafted commodity, one that needed to be controlled meticulously to maintain its appeal to the audience. This wasn't just about how they looked on screen. It was about everything. Their relationships, marriages, and even friendships were under constant scrutiny, often manipulated for the sake of publicity and marketability. Take the case of Jean Harlow, for example. Harlow, one of MGM's brightest stars, was under constant surveillance by Louis B. Mayer, who took a deep interest in her personal life. Harlow had several marriages during her career, and each one was carefully managed by the studio. Mayer was so invested in her image that he went as far as to intervene in her private life, telling her who she could and couldn't associate with. Mayer instructed Harlow to marry once again, not for love but for publicity, to maintain her image as a wholesome, lovable star. Her happiness took a back seat to the studio's need to keep her image spotless and appealing to the public. But it wasn't just Harlow. Marilyn Monroe's life was also a battleground for studio control. Monroe, one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood history, was constantly molded and reshaped by her studio bosses, who took complete control over her public persona. Her struggles with mental health and substance abuse were hidden from the public eye, while her image as a glamorous, carefree sex symbol was tightly managed. Monroe had little say in her career choices, and every aspect of her life, from her film roles to her romantic relationships, was dictated by the studio. Despite being one of the most famous women in the world, Her career was directed by those who saw her as little more than a tool for their financial gain. The same control was exerted over Elizabeth Taylor, who was also molded by MGM. Taylor's relationships, marriages, and even her public persona were all crafted by studio executives who worked tirelessly to shape how the world saw her. It's rumored that studio heads even influenced her choice of marriage, seeking to boost her appeal to the public and keep her in the limelight. Taylor was just another pawn in the studio's grand game of controlling their stars, ensuring their value remained high. This wasn't just about keeping a star's image pristine. It was about maintaining the studio's power. In an era before modern PR teams and publicity managers, the studios took it upon themselves to oversee every aspect of their stars' lives. From their public appearances to their relationships, everything was curated for maximum benefit. The goal was to create an image that kept audiences invested, regardless of the toll it took on the actor's personal life. The studio system, with its tight control over both professional and personal spheres, ensured that the stars worked for the studio, and not the other way around. But how did these stars cope with this level of control? Could anyone escape the suffocating grip of the studio bosses? The fear of losing stardom. For many of Hollywood's golden age stars, the fear of losing their stardom was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every move was watched, every decision scrutinized, and every aspect of their lives was controlled by the studio. In such an environment, the threat of being cast aside loomed large. The studio system was built to keep stars in check, and stepping out of line could have disastrous consequences. A star who dared to resist or rebel could quickly find themselves blacklisted, relegated to insignificant roles, or even erased from the screen entirely. The power the studios held over their stars was so absolute that many actors didn't even know how to exist outside of it. The system had created a protective cocoon, a carefully controlled environment in which the stars were given everything, fame, fortune, and adoration, so long as they played by the rules. But when that security was taken away, many stars were left vulnerable and unsure of how to navigate the shifting landscape of Hollywood. This was particularly evident in the 1950s when the golden age came to an end and the studio system started to crumble. Stars who had once been kings and queens of the screen suddenly found themselves struggling as their contracts expired and the system began to change. Actors who had been accustomed to being told what roles to take and what image to project were now faced with a new, more independent Hollywood. They had no blueprint to follow in this new era, and without the studio system's control, they were often left floundering. In this new wave of Hollywood, actors like James Dean and Natalie Wood emerged. These stars didn't fit the traditional mold that the studio bosses had carefully crafted. They were part of a new generation of actors who valued their independence and sought to forge their paths. But how did these actors manage to break free from the oppressive grip of the studios? What did it take for them to thrive in a Hollywood that no longer ran on the same rules? The changing landscape. While the power of the studio bosses reached its peak during the Golden Age, the landscape of Hollywood began to shift dramatically in the 1950s and 1960s. Several factors, rising television popularity, changing social norms, and the decline of the studio system, contributed to the breakdown of the old way of doing things. By the late 1960s, the studio system had essentially collapsed, and with it, the stranglehold the studio heads once held over their stars. Actors started to gain more control over their careers, and the industry landscape was forever altered. The rise of agents, personal managers, and independent producers allowed actors to take control of their destinies. They no longer had to rely on the studios to dictate which roles they could play or how they should present themselves. Actors gained the power to choose their projects and shape their careers in ways that hadn't been possible during the Golden Age. Moreover, with the rise of more independent filmmaking, actors became less targets of the studio's invasive control, allowing them to lead lives that were less scrutinized by the powerful bosses who once dictated every aspect of their existence. Yet, while the collapse of the studio system offered stars newfound autonomy, the legacy of the studio bosses didn't disappear overnight. Many aspects of the studio system's control still resonate in Hollywood today. The way stars are marketed, the intense pressure to maintain public personas, and the constant need to be visible are all echoes of the practices that were put into place by the studio heads. Even though actors now have more say in their careers, they still feel the weight of expectations, both professionally and personally. In many ways, today's celebrities face pressures that mirror those experienced by stars in the Golden Age. The studio bosses may no longer hold absolute power, but the entertainment industry's control over a star's image and career has evolved into something modernized yet still deeply ingrained in the system. So, while the Golden Age of Hollywood may be long gone, the shadow of the studio system still looms large in today's entertainment world. But do today's stars have more control? Or are they still trapped in a different kind of spotlight? If you found this behind-the-scenes look into Hollywood's history fascinating, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories from the world of old Hollywood. Who knows? Next time we might uncover a shocking twist from the past you won't want to miss.